Hello and welcome back to Chapter 6, the Circulatory System of Anatomy and Physiology for the Pre-Hospital Provider. Let's get right into this. Learning objectives. Describe the location of the heart and its relationship to other structures in the body. Name the chambers of the heart and vessels that enter or leave each chamber. Trace the pathway of a blood cell throughout the body. Name the valves of the heart and their function. State how heart sounds are created. Define blood pressure and state the normal ranges for systolic and diastolic indices. Describe the cardiac cycle. Describe the cardiac conduction system and how electrocardiogram records the electrical heart activities. Explain stroke volume, cardiac output, and the Starling's law of the heart. Explain how the nervous system regulates the function of the heart. List the structure of the function of each of the blood vessels, arteries, veins, and capillaries. Describes the exchange of gases that occur at the capillary level. Name the major systematic arteries and the parts of the body they nourish. Name the major systematic veins and the parts of the body they drain of blood. Describe the primary functions of blood. List the formed elements of blood and state the primary functions of each. Describe what happens to red blood cells at the end of their lifespan, including the state of hemoglobin. Explain the A, B, and O and Rh blood types. Name the 5 kinds of white blood cells and the functions of each. Describe the function of platelets and explain how they are involved in hemostasis. Describe the formation of a blood clot and explain how abnormal clotting is prevented in the vascular system. In the introduction, this entire diagram consists of the heart, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins, and it is a closed circuit. It kind of shows how everything works and functions and where it leads to, where it takes out of. Venules and veins are part of the pulmonary circuit. These send deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Arteries and arterioles are part of a systematic circuit, and they send oxygenated blood and nutrients to the body. All body tissues require circulation to survive. Cardiovascular disease accounts for a significant number of EMS calls. The heart is a muscular cone-shaped organ that pumps blood throughout the body. It is about the size of a closed fist, and this lies between the mediastinum, between the lungs. About 2/3 of the mass is on the left side of the human body, right about here. Myocardium is used to refer to the heart muscle itself. This is a diagram of where it lies, as well as showing what lies within the heart wall, so the epicardium, the visceral pericardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. The pericardium is a thick, fibrous membrane that surrounds the heart. This anchors the heart within the mediastinum and prevents overdistension. Serous pericardium is inner membrane of the pericardium. This contains 2 layers, the visceral layer, which is the epicardium, and the parietal layer. The major structures of the heart are the atria and the ventricles. There are 2 of each, and the normal heart consists of the 4 chambers. Atria is the upper 2 chambers of the heart, so the interradial septum, which is the membrane that separates the 2 atria. Each atrium receives blood that is returned to the heart from other parts of the body. Ventricles are lower 2 chambers of the heart. Interventricular septum is the wall that separates the right and left ventricles. Each ventricle pumps blood out of the heart. The septum separates the left atrium and the ventricle from the right atrium and ventricle. Atrioventricular valves separate the upper and lower portions of the heart. Semilunar valves are located between the ventricles and the arteries. Blood enters to the right atrium via the superior and inferior vena cava and the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus are veins that collect blood that is returning from the walls of the heart. In this diagram, it shows exactly how. Fossa ovalis is depression between the right and left atria that represents the former location of the foramen ovale. The foramen ovale is the opening between 2 atria that is present in the fetus. In the valves of the heart, we have the tricuspid valve, which separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. Papillary muscles attach to the ventricles and send chordae tendinae to the cusps. Chordae tendinae are small muscular strands that attach to the ventricles and the valves. These are connected by papillary muscles. When papillary muscles contracts, The strands end up tightening, and this prevents the regurgitation of blood through the valves. The pulmonary valve regurgitates blood flow from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery, and this contains 3 cusps. 4 pulmonary veins supply the left atrium with blood. The mitral valve is the bicuspid valve and allows the blood to pass from the left atrium into the left ventricle while preventing backflow. This closes passively. Aortic valve lies at the base of the aorta. It has 3 cusps and opens to allow blood to leave the left ventricle during contraction. This closes during relaxation to prevent blood from backing up into the ventricle. Atrioventricular valves are the mitral valve, tricuspid valve, and separate the atria and ventricles. The right atrium receives low oxygen blood through the vena cava and the coronary sinus, right here in the as it shows the valve open. The tricuspid valve opens and then closes. Blood passes from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Blood is then pumped by the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery and into the lungs. The blood enters the capillaries of the alveoli in the lungs, and this is where the gas exchange occurs. Freshly oxygenated blood is then returned to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. The blood flows through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and this pumps oxygenated blood through the aortic valve. The right and left coronary arteries supply the blood to the heart tissues. Body tissues require freshly oxygenated blood to survive. Coronary artery branches supply many capillaries in the myocardium. Anastomosis is the connection in smaller artery branches, and they alternate blood pathways, collateral circulation. Cardiac veins drain blood from the myocardial capillaries. Coronary sinus enlarged veins to join the cardiac veins and empties into the right atrium. The blood flow within the heart is as follows. The superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava return deoxygenated blood from the body to the right atrium. This blood from the upper part of the body returns to the heart through the superior vena cava. The blood from the lower part of the body returns to the inferior vena cava. From the right atrium, blood passes through the tricuspid valve onto the right ventricle. The blood is then pumped from the right ventricle through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary artery in the lungs. In the lungs, various processes take place and that return the oxygen to the blood and at the same time remove carbon dioxide and other waste products. This is talked in the respiratory system. Freshly oxygenated blood is returned to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. Blood then flows through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, which then pumps the oxygenated blood through the aortic valve into the aorta and then into the entire body. Normal heart sounds. This graph kind of shows a nice little way of sort of simplifying how the heart should sound. There's the part 1, which is lub, the closure of the mitral and tricuspid valves. Then there's dub, and that is all in the systole and the diastole. The contraction and relaxation of the heart combined with the flow of the blood generates characteristic heart sounds during auscultation with a stethoscope. Normal heart sounds sound like lub-dub, lub-dub, and the first heart sound, which is lub. This is caused by the sudden closure of the mitral and tricuspid valves at the start of the ventricular contraction. And the next sound, which is dub, which is usually more powerful. This results from the closure of both of the aortic and pulmonic valves at the end of the ventricular contraction. So part 1 and part 2 are normal and should always be present. Part 3 and part 4 are usually not heard in individuals with normal heart sound, which is da and blah. Those are abnormal heart sounds. A soft, low-pitched heart sound that occurs about 1/3 of the way through diastole is the third part. This heartbeat cycle is described as a sounding like lub, dub, da. The part 4 is a moderately pitched sound that occurs intermediately before the normal part 1 sound. When a part 4 sound is present, the heart contraction sounds like blah, lub, dub. Other abnormal heart sounds are the murmur, bruit, click, and snap. These sounds may be heard when auscultating the heart and the great vessels. In the cardiac cycle, the repetitive pumping process that begins with the onset of the cardiac muscle contraction ends with the beginning of the next contraction. Myocardial contraction results in pressure changes within the cardiac chambers, causing the blood to move from areas of the high pressure to the areas of low pressure. Systole is the contraction of the ventricular mass with its concomitant pumping of blood into the systematic circulation. The systolic blood pressure, which is BP. Diastole is the relaxation phase of the heart cycle, which is diastolic BP. BP is noted as a fraction. The systolic reading is placed above the diastolic reading. Afterload is the pressure in the aorta against which the left ventricle must pump blood. The greater the afterload, the harder it is for the ventricle to eject blood into the aorta, which is reducing the stroke volume. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped through the circulatory system in 1 minute. This is expressed in liters per minute. Cardiac output is equal to the stroke volume times the heart rate. Starling's law of the heart is a relationship first described by British physiologist Dr. Ernest Henry Starling. This states that to a point, increased venous return to the heart stretches the ventricles, resulting in increased cardiac contractility. Starling noted that if a muscle is stretched slightly prior to stimulating it to contract, it would contract harder. This means that if the heart is stretched, the muscle contracts harder. If more blood returns to the heart, the stretched heart pumps harder rather than allowing the blood to back up into the veins. The result is that more blood is pumped with each contraction, yet the ejection fraction remains unchanged. The ejection fraction is the portion of the blood ejected from the ventricle during systole. So the electrical conduction system is the mechanical pumping action of the heart that can only occur in response to an electrical stimulus. The properties and the conduction system. The electrical impulse that causes the heart to beat via a set of complex chemical changes within the myocardial cells. The brain is partially controls the heart rate and strength of contraction via the autonomic nervous system. Contraction of the myocardial tissue are initiated with the heart itself in a group of complex electrical tissue that is a part of a conduction system. The cardiac conduction system consists of 6 parts: the synovial, which is the SA node, the atrioventricular, which is the AV node, the bundle of HIS, bundle of His, the right and left bundle of branches, and the Purkinje fibers. The spectral electrical properties of the cardiac cells are the excitability, which is the ability of cells to respond to an electrical impulse, and the conductivity, which is the ability of the cells to conduct electrical impulses. Automaticity is the ability of cardiac cells to generate an impulse to contract even when there is no external nerve stimulus. The regulation of heart function is provided by the brain via the autonomic nervous system. This is the chronotropic state and the domotropic state, as well as the inotropic state. The receptors in the blood vessels, kidneys, brain, and heart monitor body functions to maintain homeostasis. Chemoreceptors, baroreceptors. Stimulation of receptors causes the activation of either the parasympathetic or sympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system, affecting both the heart rate and contractility. The contractility, parasympathetic stimulation, which is the alpha and beta effects. Hormone regulation of the heart rate, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These hormones can be used as cardiac drugs. Electrolytes, which are ions. Myocardial cells are bathed in solutions of chemicals or electrolytes. 3 positively charged ions are found in these electrolyte solutions: sodium, potassium, and calcium. In the resting cell, the concentration of potassium is greater inside the cell, and the concentration of sodium is greater outside the cell. Sodium is a potassium pump. a special ion transporting mechanism and maintains the difference in electrolyte concentrations by pumping sodium out of the cell. This process requires energy. The most important ions that can influence the heart action are potassium and calcium. Hyperkalemia, hypocalcemia, and hypocalcemia have significant effects on heart action. An electrical charge difference is caused by the difference in sodium and potassium concentration across a cell membrane at any given instant, which is the polarized state. Depolarization is the process of electrical discharge and flow of electrical activity. This is the excitation and contraction coupling. The repolarization is the period after cardiac cells depolarize, when cells begin to return to their resting polarized state. Absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. An electrocardiogram is a graph recording the electrical activity of the heart, a standard ECG, with 12 leads, which is different views. The shape differs for each lead. Several deflections or waves are noted on the ECG on each side, and these represent the normal cardiac conduction pattern: P wave, PR segment, QRS complex, ST segment, and T wave. A normal ECG cycle would look like so, with a P wave coming up, QRS wave right there, and the T wave coming just before the diastole, or just before the diastole. Then you have the P wave, the QRS again. General classes of blood vessels are arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. Arteries are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, get smaller as they get farther away from the heart. Tunica interna is the smooth, thin inner lining of the endothelium. Tunica media is the middle layer, composed of the elastic tissue and smooth muscle cells that allow the vessels to expand or contract in response to changes in the blood pressure and tissue demand. Tunica externa is the outer layer, consisting of elastic and fibrous connective tissue. We can see here how this actually looks. Innervated by sympathetic nervous system, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Changes in diameters greatly affect blood flow and pressure. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. These are semi-permeable endothelium. Capillaries have thin wall slits where endothelial cells overlap. These affect permeability, and tissues with higher metabolic rates have more capillaries than those with slower rates. Precapillary sphincters constrict or relax to control blood distribution. Gases, metabolic byproducts, and nutrients are exchanged between capillaries and the tissue fluid in surrounding body cells. Capillary walls allow diffusion of blood with high levels of oxygen and nutrients. Blood pressure is the strongest when blood leaves the heart, gets weaker as the distance from the heart increases, and the capillaries and the arterioles and lowest in the capillaries. More fluid leaves the capillaries than returns into them. The lymphatic capillaries collect excess fluid, and the mast cells contained histamine. The venules link capillaries to veins, and the veins carry the blood back to the atria. The heart requires oxygen and nutrients. These are supplied via the coronary arteries. The arteries that arise from the aorta shortly after it leaves the left ventricle are the coronary arteries. The right coronary artery divides into 9 important branches: the conus branch, sinus node branch, right ventricular branch, atrial branch, acute marginal, atrial ventricular node, posterior descending, left ventricle, and left atrial. Not all branches are always present in all people. These branches supply blood to the walls of the to the right atrium and ventricle, a portion of the inferior part of the left ventricle, and portions of the conduction system. When vessels of the conduction system fail to arise from the right coronary artery, they originate from the left side instead. The left main coronary artery is the largest and shortest of the myocardial blood vessels. These rapidly divide into two branches, the left anterior descending and the circumflex. The arteries subdivide further, supplying the blood to most of the left ventricle and intraventricular septum, and at times the AV node. Arterial sclerosis is the hardening of arteries, and coronary artery disease, which is CAD, C-A-D. Arteriosclerosis plus atherosclerosis. Bit of a mouthful. This is exactly what they look like here. Pulmonary circulation. These carry blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs and back to the left side of the heart. The oxygenated blood from the right ventricle is then pumped through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary artery. This artery rapidly divides into the right and left pulmonary arteries, which then transport the blood to the right and left lungs. Inside the lungs, the arteries branch, becoming smaller and smaller, and at the level of the capillary, waste products are exchanged and the blood is reoxygenated. The reoxygenated blood travels through the venules and the pulmonary veins. 4 pulmonary veins empty into the left atrium, 2 from each lung. Blood flow throughout the heart and the body. This is basically everything that we've went through so far. Systematic arterial circulation is oxygenated blood that leaves the heart through the aortic valve and passes into the aorta. The aorta is all arteries of the body that are derived from... So all arteries of the body are derived from the aorta. Are they wrong? The aorta is divided into 3 portions: the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, which is the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid artery, and this left subclavian artery, and the descending aorta. Circulation in the head and neck. We've got the brachiocephalic artery, the first vessel to branch from the aortic artery. It is relatively short and rapidly divides into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. Carotid arteries transport blood from the head to the head and neck. This is carotid bifurcation, carotid sinus. We know where our carotid arteries is. It's kind of where we take pulses. It's one of the main pulse points that we choose, especially because it's a very exposed area. Provided through the vertebral arteries and internal carotid arteries, left and right vertebral arteries enter the cranial vault through the foramen magnum. They then unite to form the basilar artery, the pons cerebellum, the posterior cerebral arteries. Carotid arteries enter the cranial vault through the carotid canals and give rise to the middle cerebral arteries. The middle cerebral arteries supply blood to large portions of the brain cortex. Posterior cerebral arteries are anterior cerebral arteries, anterior communicating arteries. This interconnection of arteries forms a collateral network to deliver circulation to the brain, known as the circle of Willis. The circulation to the upper extremity, the subclavian artery. This supplies blood to the brain, neck, anterior chest wall, and shoulder. Shortly after its point of origin, the subclavian artery gives rise to its vertebral arteries. At the shoulder joint, it then becomes auxiliary arteries, and below the head and humerus, the head of the humerus, it becomes the brachial artery, which is right about here, in the middle of the 2 main muscles. It's quite a muscle we use actually a lot for babies, infants as well. Brachial arteries, the ulnar and radial arteries. These are superficial, deep palmar arches, and as you can see, they show exactly where they are. So, thoracic aorta. Branches of the arteries making up the thoracic aorta include intercostal arteries running along the ribs and provide circulation to the chest wall. These branch into the anterior and posterior intercostal arteries. The visceral arteries supply blood to the thoracic organs. The abdominal aorta is the visceral and parietal portions. The visceral arteries divide into paired and non-paired branches. Major non-paired branches are the celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery, inferior mesenteric artery. The superior mesenteric artery and its branches supply blood to the pancreas, the small intestine, and colon. Paired branches supply blood to the kidneys, adrenal gland, and gonads. The parietal branches supply blood to the diaphragm and abdominal wall. The circulation to the pelvis and lower extremity, the aorta divides into two common iliac arteries. These arteries further divide into the internal iliac arteries and the external iliac arteries. The vessels form a continuum. The external iliac arteries become the femoral arteries. The femoral arteries become the popliteal artery in the lower thigh. Each popliteal artery trifurcates, branching into anterior and posterior tibial and peroneal arteries. At the foot, anterior tibial artery becomes the dorsalis pedis artery, which is another pulse point. Plantar arteries arise from the posterior tibial artery to subdivide into digital branches that supply the blood to the toes. As a rule, veins accompany the major arteries, and many veins have the same names as the arteries they accompany. External and internal jugular veins in the head and neck. Two major veins that drain the head and neck. External jugular veins that join the internal jugular vein at the base of the neck. And internal jugular veins that join the subclavian veins to form the brachial cephalic veins, which drain the superior vena cava. The venous sinuses. Here we can see the head and neck. We've got the external jugular, internal jugular, subclavian. They're right. Brachiocephalic, cephalic, and the superior vena cava. And notice how big this the vena cava is. Generally, the vena cava is about the size of if you were to, do an OK sign, or bigger. Or usually, sometimes people even say it's about your fist, but just a little bit smaller. The vena cava is really big, and it's actually a big point in, especially for trauma, for gunshot wounds ranging around your abdominal area. We have to always look for that, because if you get shot there, if there's any kind of puncture in the vena cava, especially descending vena cava, you will die within 30 seconds of internal bleeding, and there's no stopping it, really. So that's fun stuff. The veins of the hand, wrist, and forearm combine in the upper forearm to form the basilic vein and the cephalic vein. The basilic and cephalic veins combine to form the axillary vein, which then drains into the subclavian vein. The thorax is the venous drainage, and this begins at the anterior and posterior intercostal veins. The intercostal veins empty into the azygos vein into the right side of the thorax, and the hemozygous vein on the left side. These veins, along with the right side and the brachiocephalic cephalic veins, provide the major source of flow into the superior vena cava. All venous drainage from lower parts of the body pass through the inferior vena cava, which is why it's so dangerous to have trauma occur there. Within the abdominal and pelvic cavities, veins provide venous drainage from structures including the kidney, adrenal glands, gonads, and diaphragm, internal iliac veins, and external iliac veins. The hepatic portal system is a specialized part of the venous system that drains blood from the liver, stomach, intestines, and spleen. Blood from the system flows first through the liver, where it collects in the sinusoids. This blood then empties into the hepatic veins. In the lower extremity, we have the great saphenous vein, which is the longest vein in the body. This drains the foot, leg, and thigh and empties into the femoral vein. The small saphenous vein, it helps drain the leg and the lateral side of the foot. This vein of the feet also drain into the anterior and posterior tibial veins. The popliteal vein ascends through the thigh, becoming the femoral vein. Substance that is pumped by the heart through the arteries and capillaries is blood composition. This consists of plasma and formed elements or cells. So here we have blood composition, and in the centrifuge, we can see the plasma and the white blood cells, and as they separate. So this carries oxygen and nutrients to tissues, carries cell waste and products away from the tissues. It's all about blood. Plasma is the watery, straw-colored fluid, and accounts for more than half of the total blood volume. So 92% is water, and 8% is total dissolved substances. Red blood cells are known as erythrocytes. This contains hemoglobin and carries oxygen to the tissues. Erythropoiesis is a process which red blood cells are made. Erythrocytes have a lifespan of 120 days. Cells that are destined for destruction decompose in tissues that are rich in macrophages. Erythrocytes contain antigens on their surface. Antigens are substances on the surface that erythrocytes are recognized by the immune system. Antibodies are proteins within plasma that react to antigens. Individuals are classified, so blood types are the individuals that are classified as having one or four blood types based on the preference of absence of the specific antigens on their erythrocytes. So the blood types A, B, or O, so the Rh antigens. White blood cells are known as leukocytes. Diapetes, which is when leukocytes leave the blood vessels and move towards tissue where they're needed. The primary function is to fight infection. There are two types, granulocytes and granulocytes. Granulocytes are types of granulocyte. So granulocytes we've got a bunch of them, got three types. Neutrophils, which destroy bacteria, antigen, antibody complexes, and foreign matter. Eosinophils. I don't know. I'm just going to leave it at that. Function in the body's allergic response. And the basophils, which play a role in both allergic and inflammatory responses. So our granulocytes are type. We've got two types, which the lymphocytes, which originate in the bone marrow but migrate through the blood to the lymphatic tissues. The monocytes and macrophages are one of the first lines of defenses in the inflammatory process. Here is our blood composition. We've got our blood, which is formed of 45% formed elements and 55% plasma. We've then got 4.8% platelets, 95.1% red blood cells, and the 0.1% white blood cells. In the plasma, we have the electrolytes, water, proteins, waste, nutrients, and gases. Within the nutrients itself, we have the vitamins and hormones. From there, we can then break it up into the other subgroups as well. Platelets are small cells in the blood that are essential for clot formation, and blood clotting is a complex set of events involving platelets, clotting proteins in plasma, and other proteins in calcium. This occurs following an injury to a blood vessel wall. This results in homeostasis, which is cessation of bleeding, and formation in the final blood clot. Chemicals are released from the blood vessel wall. It's called local vasoconstriction and activation of the platelets, forming a temporary plug. This is what you see in like scabbing. First, you see the very thin layer shoot up, and then you see the very thicker layer, which are the white blood cells building up on top of that layer, and really building from dead skin cells. And that is basically it. Homework for the hospital academics, for the medicinal hospital academics group that we are in, you have to define what I'm going to be listing in the description, and make sure to post everything in the Discord as well. So get that done. No rush. And if you can't get it done, make sure to message me as well.